I wrote 200 films before sound came in.
Hello all, and welcome to Women Behind the Camera Class 3, Talkies, Independence, and Historical Erasure. I'm your host, Professor Saporn. I just want to address, you may notice a certain difference of mise-en-scène. That's because for today I am both behind and in front of the camera, as it were, so if I go out of focus, I'm sorry, I'm doing my best. My husband foolishly went to a party that he assured me would be safe, but turned out to have lots of people in it in a very small enclosed space that weren't wearing masks, and he stayed there for some reason for hours, not realizing that it would mean he has to self-isolate now until he can get tested. So that's why this is happening. Yay! Anyway, today we will be picking up where we left off last week with female silent film directors, exploring the story of how they mysteriously disappeared from the ranks of the film industry and recorded film history in large numbers, what happened, what enabled a small number of them to hold on to their roles even into the era of talking pictures, and how we got to where we are today. This is going to be a long one, folks, so
fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
Now, before we get started, I'd like to address something that I noticed from the class's responses to last week's hidden assignment. I don't want to leave you with the false impression that some of you, I gathered, had that female silent film directors were not known in their time. Indeed, female silent film directors, like the ones that we studied and many others that we didn't, were indeed actually famous, well-known, and celebrated household names in their times on a level that compared with their contemporary male counterparts. You can see this evidenced through fan magazines and newspaper articles from the silent era, other primary sources, journalists writing, and readers responding in with praise for the films made by female directors, celebrating their names and their work. So they were known and famous in their day. Don't get me wrong about that, okay? It wasn't until later that the female directors who helped found the film industry as we know it would be fired en masse, would suddenly and mysteriously be unable to find new work as directors in Hollywood, would fall by the wayside and be replaced with men who then were in turn the only ones being praised and celebrated, to the exclusion of women, of course, because the women were no longer being hired, and would be deliberately ignored and unrecorded in early film histories, beginning perhaps with Terry Ramsey's otherwise wonderful book, A Million and One Nights, though it is very striking if you read this book. It's full of great factual information from the time, but makes no mention of Alice Guy. I think, if there's a passing mention of Mabel Normand, it's only as an actress. There's, the long scrolling list of female silent film directors and, other, producers, editors, whatever, simply not mentioned, which is kind of weird. Anyway, that is, the Terry Ramsey book is allegedly, the earliest so-called complete history of Hollywood, and the word complete there obviously is problematic. And thus women were erased from both public discourse and the academic field of cinema studies for nearly a century. So in their time, though, women's films were popular, their names were known. It was only after they had been purged from the film industry and time had gone by that there seems to have been at least a partially deliberate effort made to forget them. I don't think it was entirely deliberate. I think that later film historians who may not have had any incentive to forget them were obviously basing their recorded histories on what had come before, and the Terry Ramsey book and others that failed to mention the women, were the foundation on which cinema scholarly history was built, for better or for worse. So anyway, this brings me to a discussion of the reading that you did for this week from Jane Gaines's book, Pink Slipped: What Happened to Women in the Silent Film Industries. Before I go any further, however, I want you to pause the video and send me an email right now with your attendance assignment for today, which will be the answer to the following question. Before you hear what I have to say about the reading, before I can influence you, tell me what you thought about it in the following terms. Number one, what answers did it give to the question of what happened to women in the silent film industries? Number 2, did you feel the answers it provided were satisfying and plausible? And number 3, why or why not? Again, this is science, so please answer honestly. And if you didn't do the reading, please just admit it, because I'll probably be able to tell anyway if you try to fudge your answer, so just make life easier for both of us, okay? So pause the video and email me the answer to those 3 questions right now. Okay, you did it? Good. As you know, as I've said before, FDU emails are time-stamped, so once again, I'll easily be able to tell if you're watching the video on time or earlier and all the way through, not merely by the question of whether or not you did this simple first assignment, the attendance assignment, which I know some of you try to do the attendance assignments and not the hidden assignments, and I can tell, so stop doing that. But like I said, based on whether or not you do the hidden assignments that are sprinkled randomly in parts throughout the entire runtime of this video, as I've described before, that's how I can tell that you're watching all the way through. Don't try to trick me. It doesn't work. I catch the slackers. Slackers! Catch them! So, anyway, most of you impressed me last week with, your success in catching every part of the hidden assignments. Good job. And of course, some of you were missing a few parts of it in your discussion board post, so I noticed that not everyone got full credit for the assignment. Gotta keep you guys on your toes. So, also FYI for the future, I didn't give any extra credit points to anyone who replied to another student's comment with just a one-word answer. You know who you are. That doesn't count. I want your real thoughts, so make an effort. On the other hand, I was very impressed by the vast majority of you, especially the sheer numbers who not only did the hidden assignment, but also went the extra mile for the extra credit and made intelligent and helpful comments. Good for you. Keep up the good work. You make me so proud. Now let's talk about the reading that you did for this week. I should preface this discussion by saying that Jane Gaines, the writer of the Pink Slipped book, is perhaps the foremost world expert on female silent film pioneers, and knowing her personally as the sort of spearhead leader of the Women Film Pioneers project with which I am currently working, as I have told you, I can tell you that she comes off very differently in person from how she comes off in her book. I don't think she intended this, and I suspect that she, might just be too close to the subject matter to have realized it, but I feel personally that to a casual reader or even an undergraduate cinema studies student just beginning their career, it strikes me that her book may come off as unintentionally sounding like it's casting a weird sort of doubt over the question of whether or not there even were silent female filmmakers. Female silent filmmakers, that is. That's better, yeah. A question that I think it's safe to answer with a resounding duh, and is particularly weird coming from the person who is literally behind the organization responsible for the compilation of that list of female film pioneers on the Women Film Pioneers Project database that I keep liking to show you over and over again. It all lends an odd sort of cognitive dissonance, I think, to the pages of her book, where, as you probably noticed, every facing page is plastered with large, high-res images of female silent film pioneers, and yet every other paragraph seems to suggest that we don't really know enough about women in the silent film industry to confirm that they existed as directors, or, to confirm what they did and actually contributed to film history, that is, or the films that they allegedly made, which is odd. Here's the thing, though, and this is really a thing that I wish that Jane Gaines's book had made clearer earlier on. We do know these things about female silent filmmakers, and we can confirm these claims made about women's filmmaking contributions in the silent era, in as much as we can know and confirm the same sorts of claims about men's contributions to the silent era's filmmaking. We have the same sorts of primary source evidence, say that 3 times fast, confirming the existence and contributions of female silent filmmakers as we do for their male counterparts. No one ever seems to have questioned these narratives, however, when they favored men, and now that they include women, it seems all of a sudden that there's this scholarly urge to put the women to much, much greater scrutiny than was ever demanded of the men. It's fine to say, as Jane seems to want to, that we can't know anything for sure about the future. And I would agree, so long as we apply this claim with equal balance to all parties and all genders involved. And I wish that Jane had spent more time in her book refocusing the lens on the questioning of the accomplishments of male filmmakers for balance, if this was really what she was about and was going to do for women, because that would be fair and scholarly, and because we have inherited a century's worth of miswritten film histories that favor men and erase women, and introducing the topic of female silent filmmakers while simultaneously questioning their positions and, you know, the contributions that they made, I feel runs the risk of doing further damage to the historical narrative if you don't then also put the same questions to their male counterparts for balance. What I think is going on here, and I confess I haven't had the call to question Jane Gaines about this yet in person in our Zoom meetings, though I do hope to work up the nerve to someday. I just respect her very deeply, and you know, like I think the world of her, so it's awkward, and I haven't gotten the courage to question her yet. But anyway, I think Jane Gaines, as you may have noticed towards the end of the first chapter that I had you read, is perhaps a little too close to the issue of historiography. You remember that word, right? Vocabulary term? Basically, I think she's a little too close to the historiography issue to be able to commit to making any definite claims about events in the distant past whatsoever that we ourselves were not there to live through and witness firsthand. I think it's in part a function of the fact that for over 100 years, cinema history books were just wrong about so much of what they claimed to teach that they forgot to mention that the creator of narrative filmmaking and the occupation of film directing was a woman, and that women held all this power and had all this influence and made all these successful movies, and so as a result, Jane Gaines concludes that the answer isn't to correct the wrong histories, it's to embrace the idea that we can't know, and, you know, a sort of historical agnosticism that I personally am a bit wary of. Why, you ask? Well, let me tell you. The reason is simple. For nearly 100 years, we've been confidently telling film students, as well as the general public, that men positively did everything that there was to do in the early silent era and founded the film industries and all of that. And, you know, people have believed these false and inaccurate statements for a very long time, and it's had real-life negative consequences on women's positions in the film industry and what people perceive as reasonable for a woman to expect to be able to achieve in the world of filmmaking today. Now, I fully understand Jane's totally reasonable fear that two wrongs don't make a right, and that over-exaggerating women's early contributions and then having to backtrack would be awkward for feminists and film scholars everywhere if we somehow turned out to be wrong. So out of caution for that circumstance, Jane questions their accomplishments and perhaps even understates them. I feel, unfortunately, in a way that might mislead, you know, non-graduate students and others who are not, like, very well versed in, you know, the issues inherent with historiography, you know, and not otherwise deeply aware of the content that her book is covering, to make the wrong conclusion that maybe women did nothing or didn't do as much, or that all of their accomplishments in the silent era were somehow faked or doubtful or in dispute. But here's the thing, though. No one is saying this stuff about the accomplishments of male silent filmmakers. We have the same kinds of evidence to support their existence as we do for the women. Why are men seen as plausible and unquestioned, while women are subjected to all of this scrutiny when the evidence is the same? People seem unwilling to question the narrative that men founded everything in the film history, that is, in part because it's what they heard first. Humans have this weird habit that you may notice of believing whatever they heard first much more strongly than whatever they heard second. It's weird. It's a strange quirk of our species. It's not great. Fight this habit if you can. You know, it's it's basically this weird, I don't know, resistance to embrace a new narrative, and this thought that, oh well, like the evidence supporting men is confirmed and older, and we heard it first. The evidence supporting women is new and we don't trust it. But like I said, the evidence is equally substantial. It's from the same era, sometimes the same sources. And the evidence is there basically to support the accomplishments of female silent filmmakers, to confirm, yes, all of this is true. And, if this is really about just the evidence, the women are just as backed up as the men. Calling female silent filmmakers into question and casting so much doubt upon them without also doing the same thing for the male silent filmmakers strikes me personally as imbalanced, misleading, and wrong, not just conceptually, but because it runs the very real-life risk of supporting and backing up the haters who would like to believe that it was only ever all about the white men, and that women's accomplishments as founders of early film history were somehow less than or in dispute. I certainly do not believe that this is Jane Gaines's intention. At least I certainly hope not, but knowing her, I seriously doubt that that's what she meant to do. And I hope that she'll address these issues someday, maybe in a future edition of her book or something, and I hope and pray that if ever she gets a hold of this video, she'll understand that I respect her deeply and do not mean any harm at all in this critique of her book. Sorry, Jane, I'm sorry. Anyway, gotta teach the kids, you know how it is. So, suffice it to say that I disagree with Jane's conclusion, that it is, better to, not state a fact about history if you fear that there's any possibility of being wrong, because we've inherited probable thousands of years worth of histories that contain confidently stated factual inaccuracies and falsehoods, and these have shaped our culture as we know it. And the answer in my mind is that it would be better to correct these inaccuracies to the best of our current knowledge and abilities, so as to teach as best we can, with the unstated, that is, but implicit understanding that if ever we turn out to be wrong about anything, future generations will hopefully find out about it and correct us to the best of their abilities, just as we have been correcting our forebears. It's an imperfect system, to be sure, but it's how it's always been done. And if we resist discussing history until we can state a fact with absolute 100% perfection, we will have to simply stop recording and teaching history as a subject, because human beings are flawed, imperfect creatures and not even capable of perceiving anything with absolute 100% perfection, let alone recording it and teaching it. And yet, the field of history must go on. Oh, this has been a discussion of what now? Historiography. You know it. We've been over that. Don't forget it. It's a very important word. Now here's the first part of your hidden assignment for tonight. And yes, there will be others, and you may not be submitting them all on the same platform. So stay tuned and pay attention, okay? Here is the assignment. So, tell me at least one thing that stuck out to you about the film Be Natural, The Untold Story of Alice Guy Blaché that you watched, right? You did watch it, didn't you? It was assigned, it's required. Oh, anyway, it could be anything, just prove to me that you watched it. You did watch it, right? By replying to your previous email to me with, anything that stuck out to you about the film, or admit that you didn't watch it, slackers! Slackers! Because I will catch you. So pause the video and go do that right now. Okay, did it? Good. So, now let's talk about the soft purge, as I like to call it, and the question of what happened to women in the silent film industries. A question which, I personally feel like the book pink-slipped What Happened to Women in the Silent Film Industries, despite its title, doesn't really address or answer to my personal satisfaction at all. The ideas that it lays out seems to be that, number one, to begin with, maybe women weren't in as important positions in the silent film industries as we thought they were. An idea that I think that we can dismiss for obvious reasons I already talked about. I think that's simply not likely at all. Number two, that the entrance of Wall Street finance capital investment in the film industry coincided with the exodus of female film directors, fact which cannot really be disputed. Number 3, that this finance capital may have been a factor in why women were kicked out, which I personally think is probable, though the book doesn't really explain exactly how. And 4, that the exodus of female directors had to do with labor redundancy and the idea that women were replaced by men because they had become redundant or unnecessary, an idea that I would like to explore further right now. So, the book seems to argue that once male directors had learned what they could learn from female directors about how to appeal to female audiences, that they then made female directors redundant by being able to do the same work and hence replaced them. Now, at a glance, that sounds like it makes sense, right? Except that the entire premise completely falls apart when you really think about it and subject it to scrutiny. Here's why. The idea of labor redundancy hinges on the idea that there's some incentive for employers to prefer the replacement to the previous labor force, as with mechanization. It can't simply be the same. The replacement has to be preferable for some reason in order to incentivize the choice to replace the previous workers with something new, otherwise you would use what you have that is currently working. Basically, an employer, for example, has the incentive to prefer to use machinery to, say, build cars because the machines can do the job cheaper, faster, and safer, hence making the human laborers redundant and likely to be let go in preference for the machines. Mechanization! But this idea simply doesn't work when you're comparing male and female directors of the silent era. It doesn't hold up. They are the same. There's no evidence at all that male directors were ever in any way superior or preferable to female directors for any reason. There's no evidence to support the claim that male directors were, say, any more efficient or safer or faster. They certainly weren't cheaper. And they were not even more successful at the box office on the whole than female directors either. And in fact, as stated in the documentary Without Lying Down, which you will be watching in a couple of weeks, by 1920, the sole person considered the most important producer of the biggest money-making features in the history of the film business was Lois Weber, the director of The Blot, Shoes, and all those other social issue films that feel to me like they were written and directed by Bernie Sanders.
Oh my word!
Basically, in short, in terms of every possible measure of film industry success, men weren't better than women as directors, making the idea of labor redundancy clearly irrelevant to the discussion and not the right answer to the question of what happened to women in the silent film industries. Unless, of course, there's the big, hairy, testosterone-filled white male elephant stinking up the pages of the labor redundancy argument, the unstated assumption that men are inherently preferable to women in a sexist patriarchal society for no other reason than rank obvious sexism. Because let's be clear, all evidence points to female directors having been as good as men, if not better, by every conceivable measure that is out there. If there were some incentive to fire all the women and hire new directors in their place and sexism was not a factor, then it stands to reason that at least half of the new directors hired would have also been women. But that's not what happened, making the obvious answer, the simplest answer, the most logical and clearest in-your-face answer, likely the correct one. What happened to women in the silent film industries? Sexism. To be more exact, I personally believe, for various reasons, which we will be exploring further throughout the semester, that it happens something like this. Men who had previously understood filmmaking as not particularly empowering or lucrative as of a job, early on, there was this misunderstanding, like we talked about, that it was somehow like sewing, that they basically didn't see it coming that this was going to be an avenue through which women could achieve huge amounts of fame, money, success, and power as directors in the new technological medium, and it threatened the patriarchal lie that men are inherently superior to women, which of course caused male studio owners to react in the ways that we have observed and recorded, purging female directors from the ranks of Hollywood studios without leaving us any trail of a reason why. Probably because they knew that what they were doing wasn't cool. I personally believe that it, frightened or otherwise disturbed the rich and powerful businessmen who owned the rich and powerful film studios, or possibly the rich and powerful Wall Street businessmen who were investing their finance capital into the male-owned film studios to see women in such positions of power. The consolidation of film studio power circa 1920 happened because of the advent of Wall Street businessmen investing huge amounts of money into the film industry. Doing so, I would note, according to the research that I have done so far and to my present knowledge, exclusively funding male-owned film companies and not any companies owned by women, thus putting a competitive stranglehold on the remaining female-owned companies at the time, and perhaps also even pressuring film studios that they were funding to replace their female directors with male ones, maybe even directly, out of a belief that men in charge meant good business or something like that, because after all, at the time there weren't really many women on Wall Street, and if Wall Street is where this money is coming from, the contemporary idea of a sound business investment came with the assumption of a male face, especially in 1920. Even today, it kind of does. Wall Street's a very male-dominated venue. So, again, we have no known documentation or concrete proof of any of this. Like I said, there's no decree that you can point to that says, "Oh, we hereby kick out the women." This was done without comment, which I think speaks volumes, ironically enough. Though this is all just speculation, I think until we have better information, it nevertheless stands as reasonably sound speculation based on circumstantial evidence that tells a coherent, logical, and consistent story. So that's what I think happened to women directors in the silent film industries. That's what I think caused the soft purge of female directors from the ranks of Hollywood studios, and that's the narrative that makes the most sense to me, having studied this for years. And again, until we have better, more reliable, empirical information, I personally feel it's fair to accept this informed speculation as our best extant answer for the time being. That's really the inherent problem, as I said before, with patriarchy, or honestly with matriarchy too, to be fair. The definition of one gender in terms of its superiority or inferiority to the other gender, it's an inherently problematic concept that makes every success of the oppressed gender seem threatening to the members of the winner gender, who define themselves in terms of their superiority to the loser gender, and thus incentivizes the winner gender to keep the loser gender down, or force them out of the competition. And we're going to be seeing a whole lot of parallel stories like this, not just in the field of directing. Stay tuned for next week's editing class, and then producing. There's parallel narratives that real living women today can tell you about that I think confirm everything that I've just been saying. So let's continue. Where was I? Yeah, so obviously, at the end of the day, the answer is not to define yourself or your gender in terms of anyone else. Duh, it's nonsense. Be you. Other people and their successes are as irrelevant to you as they are to your gender. And I really do sincerely hope that all of you are well aware of this, because it's true. In short, the problem is that if you admit that men and women are equal, you simply cannot sustain a patriarchy. Or a matriarchy, to be fair, they can be just as sexist. And in the early 20th century, patriarchy was, of course, the name of the game. Women got their foot in the door of the filmmaking world before anyone understood what power there was to be found there. Women were unceremoniously kicked out en masse, fired by male studio heads, unfunded by male Wall Street businessmen, blacklisted at other film studios, and not recorded by contemporary historians once it was clear to everyone what power could be found in the field of film directing. There's a parallel story to be told here, and a pattern which I'll be asking you to comment on later. So bookmark this discussion in your brain. It may be a part of a hidden assignment that will come later, so just, make a note and look forward for more information to follow. There you go. So, this brings me to a discussion of what happened after the soft purge, after the mass exodus of female film directors circa the year 1920. Does the history of female film directors simply end there in the silent era? Oh no, of course not, you knew that. So first off, there were a few holdouts that made it past the soft purge in the classical Hollywood studio system, and they are rare and exceptional and interesting, and we're going to talk about them. So first of all, there weren't that many of them, and they didn't last very long generally. As I had said before, Lois Weber continued on as a film director until after 1920, largely because of her repeated box office smashes and standout financial successes of her films until circa 1923, so 3 years past the soft purge, when her first box office disappointment in A Chapter in Her Life gained only moderate success, and a combination of shifts in her personal life, largely the dissolution of her marriage the year before, and her displeasure with working in the increasingly mass-produced production line atmosphere of the Hollywood studio system as it consolidated power, led to her taking repeated hiatuses from filmmaking, though she would arguably continue to direct films sporadically until her final film in 1934. Incidentally, Lois Weber happens to have also made some of the first sound films in American history, according to Wikipedia, the first, which is kind of funny how you never hear about that in film history classes, right? But you hear about Thomas Edison, whose, sync sound film experiments were an infamous disaster. He failed to do it epically to the point where people were, leaving the theater and demanding their money back. But, Lois Weber, and not to mention Alice Guy, who granted did it first in France, who made some of the best, earliest color sync sound films, really at the dawn of cinema. It's crazy. But they don't talk about that, right? I'm talking about it. You should talk about it too. So in addition to, making perhaps the first ever synchronized sound films in American history, Lois Weber obviously also directed Talkies after synchronized sound was established as an industry standard in the year 1927. That's right, I said Talkies, a vocabulary term. So, talkies, or a talkie, or a talking picture, is late 1920s slang describing a motion picture specifically with synchronized sound, very much like how the word movie is early 20th century slang for the word motion picture, the words motion picture, describing a photoreal image that appears to move on screen. That's right. If you thought that the word talkie sounded dorky and old and outdated, well, guess what? The word movie is the same and is even older. So every time you hear the word movie, think of the word talkie, and remember that it's literally slang from your great-great-grandmother's generation that stuck. And talkie is actually the newer, hipper, younger word of the two. Now, I want you to understand what happened in Hollywood from 1920, the establishment of the studio system that would dominate the classical Hollywood period, until 1948, when a Supreme Court ruling basically trust-busted the monopoly, or technically oligarchy, of the Hollywood studio system, through the rest of the decade of the 1920s. What happened in the 20s in Hollywood? So this was a time when, early on at the beginning of this decade, larger film companies were buying or pushing smaller companies out of business, consolidating power, the big fish eating the little fish, until there were only 5 major Hollywood film studios left controlling and dominating the industry, known hereafter as the Big Five. Why don't we make that a vocabulary term? Big Five. So, the Big Five were, in this order, MGM, Paramount, RKO, Fox, and Warner Brothers throughout most of the classical Hollywood period, with Fox and Warner Brothers occasionally changing places depending on their finances and the given year. These were the 5 most powerful filmmaking companies. Famously, Warner Brothers was always sort of at the bottom of the list, and interesting tidbit, the film industry actually had sync sound technology, as you probably guessed, considering that Alice Guy was able to make early sync sound films in the early 1900s. Obviously, this is something that, we've had for a while. The film industry sat on it, and basically it wasn't until 1927 that Warner Brothers, the weakest of the big 5 studios, decided to be competitive by forcing the change to sound. So that's why we have sync sound, yay! So yes, the film industry totally could have done sync sound way earlier than 1927, but they chose not to, actually for business reasons, because they knew it would be expensive to shift to sound, and so the big 5 basically were willing to, honestly, they probably would have gone on doing silent film till heaven knows when, had it not been for Warner Brothers deciding to make a little bit more money by forcing the change to sound. So anyway, backtracking a little bit to the beginning of the 1920s, here's a quote from film historian Shelley Stamp describing the Hollywood landscape circa 1922 that I think will be of interest here. It says, "In an age of studio conglomeration and vertical integration," a word we'll be talking about in a minute, a phrase, not a word, it's 2 words, "few independents could survive, a reality that hit women particularly hard. Both Alice Guy Blaché and Nell Shipman closed their production companies during this period as well. Will Hayes, newly installed at the MPPDA, that's Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, was also beginning to assert greater control over studio releases." And that's the end of the quote. Now, Will Hayes, of course, was perhaps the most famous film censor in cinema history, and he and Lois Weber are known to have butted heads early on over the edgy political content of her films. But that quote contains, like I said, a very interesting phrase that I want you to remember: vertical integration. Vertical integration. So, vertical integration refers to a business model in which both the product and the supply chain that distributes that product are owned by the same company, and in terms of Hollywood, it refers to the fact that the big 5 studios owned their own separate theater chains in addition to owning the film studios that produced the movies that would play at these theaters. Basically, this meant that they could guarantee that their theaters would only play films made by their own companies as a way of strangling out competition. This is why, in the past, the original movie theater chains were named things like the Paramount Theater and the Fox Theater, and some of these historic theaters do still exist. The Paramount Theater would only play Paramount films, and of course the same would be with the Fox Theater, only playing films by the Fox Company. And if you wanted to see a movie from a specific studio, you had to go to that specific studio's theater. Like if you wanted to see, a Warner Brothers movie, but you lived next to a Paramount Theater, you could never see the Warner Brothers movie at the Paramount Theater. You'd have to drive across town to the Warner Brothers Theater. That's how it worked. So it wasn't like today where you could see movies made by different companies at the same theater, assuming that theaters were open. The sadness. Someday they'll be back, I promise you they will be back. But anyway, basically, that's the sort of thing that you can get away with if you can pull off vertical integration. Generally speaking, vertical integration is great for business. So good, in fact, that it can often become an illegal form of corporate trust. A monopoly, or in this case, again, an oligarchy, like a monopoly with multiple, people, or in this case, multiple companies. Basically in violation of significant antitrust laws, like the recently and very sadly overturned 1948 Paramount decision, and can wield, its power to crush out the voices of any and all independent filmmakers from companies outside the Big 5 at the height of its power, with just a few exceptions coming from, the low-end movie serial studios of Poverty Row that would make cheap things like early cowboy and superhero shorts that would be, shown before a main feature. So, once Hollywood had established this kind of power in the 1920s, which lasted until 1948 with the Supreme Court Paramount decision, you know, basically for all of the time in between 1920 to 1948, the studio system was run by a kind of notorious old boys club, the forebears, unfortunately, of today's Harvey Weinsteins, strangled out the independent studios, many of which had been owned by women, and refused to hire female directors, with a notable few exceptions. Obviously, there was Lois Weber. We're going to keep that in. I don't have time. Lois Weber, who we talked about, directing films on and off and increasingly off until 1934. There was Dorothy Davenport Reed, an independent producer who wrote and produced a great number of films and also directed a few, though never for a big five studio. She was an independent and an unusual one who was able to compete early on anyway. And exactly which ones she directed is somewhat disputed, but it is known that she directed some of them. Dorothy Davenport Reed had been married to actor Wallace Reed, who had been injured in a train wreck in transit to a film shoot and was given prescription morphine so as to be able to keep filming on schedule despite extreme pain. He became addicted to the drug and died as a result, and like Lois Weber and other female film directors that we covered last week, Dorothy Davenport Reed was spurred by this tragedy in her life to use her filmmaking platform to address important social issues, making one of the earliest known feature films about drug addiction, Human Wreckage, in 1923, and used the filmic medium to address other important social issues like violence against women and prostitution. Interestingly, like Lois Weber, Dorothy Davenport Reed's last directing credit was also in 1934. I think that's an interesting coincidence and suggests that Will Hays, that famous film censor, may have been partially to blame because it was his Hays Code that began to be enforced, his censorship code that began to be enforced that same year, 1934, as we will be talking about in a minute. Because our third and final female film director to make it past the soft purge of classical Hollywood is Dorothy Arzner. Dorothy Arzner is an extremely interesting and extremely rare case of a female director who started in Hollywood in 1922, after the soft purge. That's very strange. I don't think there is anyone in that decade or for many decades after who started after 1920. Bizarre. And lasted until 1943, almost a decade after Lois Weber, the last studio director who was a woman, left the industry. So take that, film scholars who say no woman after 1925. Don't forget Dorothy Arzner. She was there. Another interesting fact about Dorothy Arzner is that she was a butch lesbian, known for wearing masculine clothing out in public in her daily life as well as on set, and having affairs with some of her female stars. Looking at you, Clara Bow and Billy Burke. Ooh, rumors. Anyway, Arzner started directing arguably as early as 1922, when Blood and Sand, a film that she was hired by Paramount to edit, required some extra coverage shooting for the bullfighting scenes, which she shot, directed, and edited in herself. In 1926, she received an offer from Columbia, a lesser studio, to direct an A picture, or a prestigious high-budget feature film, and used that offer from Columbia, the lesser studio, as negotiating leverage with Paramount to get Paramount, a much more powerful film studio where she already worked as an editor, to offer her a directing job as well. It worked, and after directing 4 successful hits for Paramount in just 2 years, that's 3 from 1927, including Fashions for Women, 10 Modern Commandments, and Get Your Man, and 1 from 1928, Manhattan Cocktail. She was offered the job of directing Paramount Pictures' first ever sound film, or talkie, 1929's The Wild Party. This film is actually the film that is said to have made actor Frederick March a star. That's only one of the many stars that Dorothy Arzner was credited with, making, basically. Now, I apologize for the broken promise on your syllabus. I don't actually have a clip from The Wild Party for you right now, but I do have the Turner Classic Movies introduction for that film by Robert Osborne and the author of this week's reading, Women Film Pioneers Project leader and former Duke/current Columbia University Cinema Studies professor Jane Gaines. I'm going to do something a little tricky here. I'm going to play you their introduction to The Wild Party, followed by a clip from a different Dorothy Arzner movie, a film called Dance Girl Dance from 1940. That, typical of Arzner's work, is critical of the idea of heterosexual romance as a happy ending, is celebratory of women with careers, and packs a solid punch at the idea of the objectification of women for the male gaze. Let's watch the introduction to The Wild Party, followed by a clip from Dance Girl Dance, just to mess with you, in which Maureen O'Hara plays a legitimate dancer whose job it is to annoy the audience with classical dancing in between the acts of a striptease artist to get them riled up. Right before going on stage, however, her dress gets ripped, leading to the events that follow. Let's watch.
Hi, I'm Robert Osborne. We're up to evening number 4 in our Salute to Women Film Pioneers, and we have another great lineup of groundbreaking movies for you right now. And to help me introduce you to some of these great filmmakers is Jane Gaines, a professor at Duke University and the director of the film and video program there. Welcome back, Jane.
Great to be here, Robert.
Thank you. Now, our first film tonight was one of the most anticipated films of its time because it featured the talking debut of one of the biggest stars of the day, the It Girl, Clara Bow. The movie is The Wild Party from Paramount Pictures in 1929 and directed by a woman, Dorothy Arzner. Now, this was a huge movie, Paramount's first talking picture, the first talking picture, as I said, for Clara Bow. Jane, why did they entrust such an important project to Dorothy Arzner?
Well, Robert, why not? She was at Paramount and she had been there doing heading the editing department for a couple of years. She started directing in 1927. She knew that business inside out. She'd begun at the bottom, writing scripts. She was the consummate professional. You just take a look at her, the photos of her. She's so crisp and so impeccably dressed, and she did everything extremely well. She was so competent.
Now, she got along very well with Clara Bow, didn't she? And
Yes.
Clara Bow was kind of a complicated lady.
Well, Dorothy worked with a lot of stars. Katharine Hepburn,
Crawford.
Joan Crawford, definitely. And the anecdote that we all like to tell about Wild Party is how she had, found that there was trouble Clara had with the microphones. Stationary microphones weren't working. So she devised this fishing pole that hung over the heads of the stars, and it became the boom mic.
Wow.
So she was inventive, definitely.
And she's one of the few directors, maybe the only woman director, that kind of went into the 30s and 40s.
Yes,
didn't
her career was a relatively long career, up until 1943. And she was really the lone woman in the studio system. And we remember her for that. It's very important to know that she stuck it out when others didn't.
Why didn't her success open the door for more women, would you say?
Well, it wasn't that simple, of course, Robert. One woman didn't mean that another woman could do it. I think that they made exceptions to the rule, and I think Dorothy was that exception. So it didn't translate to opportunities for others. But what's interesting to me is the way these women remember the women who went before. Dorothy, in an interview later in her life, says that she had worked with Herbert Blanchet, who she refers to as the husband of the directress Alice Guy Blanchet. So there was a way in which they remembered every single one.
Yes. Let's have a look at the movie. Here's the film from 1929, co-starring Clara Bow and Frederick March, The Wild Party, directed by Dorothy Arzner.
What are you going to do now, cry?
Go ahead and stare. I'm not ashamed. Go on, laugh. Get your money's worth. Nobody's going to hurt you. I know you want me to tear my clothes off so as you can look your 50 cents worth. 50 cents for the privilege of staring at a girl the way your wives won't let you. What do you suppose we think of you up here? With your silly smirks your mothers would be ashamed of. And we know it's the thing of the moment for the dress suits to come and laugh at us, too. We laugh right back at the lot of you, only we're paid to let you sit there and roll your eyes and make your screamingly clever remarks. What's it for? So as you can go home when the show's over and strut before your wives and sweethearts and play at being the stronger sex for a minute? I'm sure they see through you just like we do.
Now, I apologize for the spoilers here, but Dance Girl Dance blew me away when I first saw it, not only for its obvious powerful feminism, as you just saw in that clip, but because I realized that it was the first, in fact, the only film I have ever seen in which a woman is faced with the classic choice between a man and her career, and she goes for the career, and the film treats it like it was the right decision. That's her happy ending, and it's great. It blew my mind because outside of this movie, every single feature film I have ever seen to deal with the idea of a woman with a career, from 1933's Babyface to 2006's The Devil Wears Prada, to whatever the Hallmark Channel is currently playing right now as you watch this, every single one of these films pushes the idea that the right choice for women is always to sacrifice their careers for a man. Dance Girl Dance remains the only film I have ever seen that validates the woman's career as her happy ending. Spoiler alert, she doesn't get the guy, and it's great. It's fine. In fact, it's clearly the right thing for everyone, and everyone lives happily ever after because of it. Leave it to Dorothy Arzner to make it happen. Maybe we need more lesbian directors working for the Hallmark Channel. Now, you also learned an interesting little tidbit from Jane Gaines there in that introduction to the movie that you didn't see, The Wild Party. Dorothy Arzner invented the boom mic. Interesting how these things aren't really generally known. The boom mic, a basic core necessity of every sound film, a pole with a microphone attached used to capture the sound overhead so that, you don't have to strategically hide microphones around a set awkwardly like they tried to at the beginning. Famously, if you see like a low budget movie, often from the 70s, like there'll be like this thing hanging in the corner of the shot. That's the boom. You don't want the boom in the shot. It's pretty funny. So, as Jane Gaines points out, Arzner was treated as the exception to the rule that excluded female directors, and I think there's a very interesting question about gender to be explored here. I don't know the answer to this question, but I'll pose it nonetheless, and feel free to email me if you have speculations or thoughts about this. I'd be happy to give you extra credit if you have anything interesting or worthwhile to contribute. My question is, does it seem possible that maybe Dorothy Arzner might have been a little bit more acceptable as a director to the patriarchal Hollywood studio system because of her masculine self-presentation? Was the idea of a butch masculine lesbian holding directorial power somehow more acceptable or perhaps less threatening than a feminine woman holding the same kind of power as a director in Hollywood studio film? We may never know, but it strikes me as, at the very least, an interesting coincidence that the only female director to not only make it this deep past the soft purge of 1920, not only to be hired after the soft purge happened, the only one to be hired after that year, but the only one to last as long as she did, becoming the single most prolific female studio director in the history of American cinema by far, and was also the only masculine presenting lesbian woman to direct films in Hollywood. Seems like maybe more than a coincidence here, at least to me. Maybe her sexuality, particularly her gender presentation, might have been a factor that actually worked to her advantage in navigating the patriarchal Hollywood studio system. We may never know, again, but I find this question fascinating in terms of what an otherwise rather sexist and homophobic environment the Hollywood studio system was always known to have been, and what a fascinating reversal of the usual expectations the case of Dorothy Arzner really provides. Interestingly, it's said that the reason why Arzner left the Hollywood studio system in 1943 was because of the increasing of systemic sexism and homophobia after the implementation of the Hays Code. I told you we'd be back to that. That quote, by the way, from Wikipedia. It's interesting, isn't it, that the other two notable women directors who made it past the soft purge both stopped directing in 1934, the same year that the Hays Code began to be enforced, and now we're hearing from Wikipedia that the Hays Code was also the reason why Dorothy Arzner left the studio system as well. But Professor Saporin, perhaps you're asking at this point, if you've never had a class with me in the past, what the heck is the Hays Code? And the answer is a vocabulary term. So, the Hays Code, also known as the Motion Picture Production Code, was a set of guidelines overseen by and named after Will Hays, former Postmaster General, political figure, and by now famous film censor, because that's really what his greatest legacy turned out to be. A list of do's and don'ts meant as a form of self-censorship so that Hollywood could police itself without inviting outside legislation from Congress, making legal rules about what Hollywood films could and couldn't show. Basically, this was Hollywood's self-censorship system until the rating system that we now use was invented in 1968. The Hays Code was notoriously, unfortunately, racist and homophobic, but it also contained some stipulations that were actually not so bad, and perhaps most people today would agree with as good ideas, like forbidding the defamation of any religion in a Hollywood film. That was part of the Hays Code. Also, forbidding films that were shot in a way that could instruct the audience as to how to commit crimes. Maybe it's a good idea not to show people the easiest way to commit a murder in a way that might inspire people to actually do it. Probably a good idea, at least I would think. Ultimately, also instituting limitations that forced filmmakers to tell their stories, often with greater creativity, often resulting in more artistic shots that implied things like violence or sex, with poetic visual symbolism rather than graphic actuality. So there's some good and some bad about the Hays Code. It's complicated. There's also a very interesting history, if ever you take my Blondes and Bombshells class, which I highly recommend, about how the Hays Code sort of interacted with the way that women were being portrayed in the 1930s, and actually turned out to be, we later found out, the only thing really preventing massive gender nudity bias exploitation of women until the 1960s, when we replaced the Hays Code with, the Hays Code was sort of being ignored by that point, but when it was replaced with the rating system, all of a sudden you see, this disproportionate tidal wave of naked women, and not really any full frontal male nudity, except for in a couple of films, usually used for comedy. So in an ironic sense, the Hays Code, even though it was censorship, did in some ways actually do some interesting good. It's complicated, and it's hard to argue one way or the other about it. I think it's interesting to, if you can read the whole thing, it's available online. So basically don't assume that the Hays Code was entirely bad or entirely good. It certainly had its flaws, and it had some good aspects too. So anyway, where are we now? Women invented narrative filmmaking and directing as we know it in the 1890s, rocked the house and directed films like it was normal everyday business until the Suits kicked them out in 1920. 3 notable women held out past that date, and all 3 seem to have left either directly after the Hays Code's enforcement in 1934 or holding out till a decade later and quitting because of the Hays Code in 1943. The Hays Code was ultimately, a deeply conservative voice in the film industry, crafted in large part to reflect contemporary Catholic sentiment, as the Catholic Church was at the time perhaps the most vocal organization decrying and threatening to boycott Hollywood's immoral films in large numbers, and obviously not wanting to lose their business. That's why the Hays Code was written, to reflect the perceived preferences of conservative Catholic filmgoers. Basically, considering that all the women we have studied, including the last 3 holdouts, were extremely liberal progressive voices making films in line with their political beliefs, and considering that the Hays Code is known to have been a deeply conservative set of rules that gave them trouble, and in Arzner's case is known to have directly driven her away, it would seem reasonable to believe that this deeply conservative political voice was effectively the nail in the coffin of women's participation in the Big 5 studios during the classical Hollywood period. Now, before we move on and leave Dorothy Arzner completely behind, I should also mention that despite leaving Hollywood, Arzner continued making shorts, women's Army Corps training films for World War II, and Pepsi commercials later on, among other things. Though she did not work as a mainstream Hollywood studio director after 1943. But this mentioning of the women of World War II brings me to a brief side tangent I'd like to have you think about for your hidden assignment. A certain parallel with the experience of female film directors that I'd like to discuss. Let's take a look at a clip from the documentary Wasps, Women Air Service Pilots in World War II.
For 2 short years,
We were the guinea pig class. We were the experiment to see if women could really fly military planes.
over 1,000 American women took to the skies,
Our mission was to fly.
piloting military aircraft for the first time.
I flew 36 different kinds of planes.
They did it for the love of flight
Oh, I just liked flying.
and the love of country.
If I can help so that some man can go over and fight this war, that's all that was important.
Until December 20th, 1944, when it all came to an end.
That was the saddest day in my life.
They were known as WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots, and this is their story. Carol Selfridge's view of the world, like many of the WASP, was one where women did not sit back and watch life fly by.
It was just made us mad when the men would say, "You can't fly this," or "You don't fly this," or you know, that's what would make you mad. I think I had a unique experience because when I started instrument flying, my instructor said, "Where have you done this before?" And I said, nowhere. I said, I haven't had any instrument flying. He said, oh yes, you have. And I told him what I'd done, flying with Dad, mapping and holding a course online and holding my wings level and holding the altitude. He said, that's it. You learned instrument flying.
2 months before Class 4410 graduated, the word came down. Class 4410 would be the last class. Letters were sent to WASP announcing their deactivation effective December 20th, 1944.
Oh, I was heartbroken. Heartbroken. It was awful. I was mad at Congress. They were the people who put us out of work. And their simple statement was that the boys were coming home from overseas and the boys were angry because they didn't have any planes to fly.
When they disbanded us, they took all of our records, they sealed them, they stamped them classified, and they filed them away in the government archives. They were there for 33 years unopened, so that when the historians wrote the history of World War II, of course, they didn't have our records available. Therefore, we weren't in the textbooks, or we weren't in the historian's account of World War II. It was not until 1977, 33 years after we were disbanded, that the Air Force put out a PR statement saying that they were graduating 10 women pilots, the first women in history to fly military aircraft. And we said, now you've crossed the line.
In 1977, the WASP were recognized. President Jimmy Carter signed legislation giving the women military status and benefits. It was a big step, one that meant they were no longer living in the shadows of history.
I didn't care about the veteran status. The only thing I cared about was the fact that now we can have an American flag on our coffins. That was the only thing that was important to me.
Now, like I said, just bookmark that in your brain for now. It's going to be part of your hidden assignment. I'm trying to unfold a sort of parallel narrative here, and this is just one piece of the puzzle. So hold on to it, and there will be more to come later. So the sad truth is that after Dorothy Arzner left the business in 1943, a woman would not direct another film for a major Hollywood studio for decades. In fact, as far as my research for this class was able to uncover, not until the late 1980s, we're talking 1943 to 1987, with no female directors in major Hollywood studios. That's over 40 years in which generations of talented women were ignored and prevented from ever directing major motion pictures for the most powerful film studios in the world. I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope that I've somehow overlooked someone, or that there's someone who was erased from history who will be discovered and re-examined in the future. But from where I stand now, with the research that I was able to do in the time that I had, this really does seem to be the case. There were, however, independent filmmakers, those who worked for much smaller, lower budget studios, and those who founded their own studios who managed to squeeze into the business, especially in the 1950s, after Hollywood had lost some of its power and was suffering from competition with television and the fallout of the Supreme Court Paramount decision. There were obviously always, women making small things, documentaries. There were, of course, female directors in other countries. But when we're really, if you're looking specifically at Hollywood studios, there seems to be nothing between 1943 and 1987. The earliest and most notable exception, is Ida Lupino, who is still an independent director. She did not technically work within the Hollywood studio system, though she was a Hollywood actress who created her own film company independently together with her husband, another one of those husband-wife teams that we talked about, and was able to distribute her films you know, thanks to the end of the vertical integration of the studio system in 1948, when the Supreme Court, you know, struck that, you know, down and ruled that the big 5 film studios had to divest themselves of their theater chains, selling them off and resulting in the possibility for independent films like those made by Ida Lupino to be screened and distributed to theaters around the United States for the first time in decades. What kind of films did Ida Lupino make, you might wonder? You guessed it! Progressive social problem films! Oh, do we see a pattern here? So her 2 most famous films, The Hitchhiker and The Bigamist, both from the year 1953, stand out as engaging and strikingly unusual, especially for their time. The Hitchhiker, a film about 2 men who pick up a hitchhiker who, of course, turns out to be a serial killer, is extremely suspenseful and remains the single most prolonged and intense depiction of male helplessness and vulnerability that I have ever encountered throughout all my studies of American film history. The male victims of the serial killer's movie-long mind games are depicted as helpless in a way that Hollywood films usually reserves exclusively for women. And I'd recommend the film strongly just for that reason alone, in addition to the fact that it also uses real Mexican actors who speak their native dialect throughout the film without the use of subtitles, which stands out as both shockingly progressive and also impressive in terms of how clear and fluid the storytelling is, even without any knowledge of the Spanish language. It's actually quite impressive. You should see it. But it is perhaps the ending of her film The Bigamist, in which Lupino also stars, that stands out as perhaps the most politically impressive, and not only depicts a surprisingly sympathetic portrait of a polygamous marital situation, but it also blows the lid off of the very idea of why bigamy is even illegal in the United States in the first place. Let's take a look at The Bigamist right now.
Harry Graham is in no sense a hero, certainly. But neither is he a monster. He's an ordinary man that made one terrible mistake. In this case, there's a peculiar sense of irony. If Harry Graham had taken Phyllis Martin as his mistress, some people would have winked an eye and turned their head. But because he gave her and the child she bore him his name and an honorable place in the community, he must be utterly destroyed. Now, I don't deny that the defendant should be punished. But I do believe that in this case, punishment might well be tempered with mercy. Thank you.
As the prosecutor has pointed out, there are many bigamous marriages going on that nobody knows about. The prosecutor is also quite correct in observing that this is a condition which strikes at the very roots of our society.
Please stop it. I'm guilty. Why go on talking about it?
As the counsel for the defense has brought out, there's irony in this case, tragic irony. I suspect that the defendant may have even loved both these women. Perhaps he even needed them both. I also suspect that he may now have lost them both. When he's once more a free man, it won't be a question of which woman he'll go back to, but rather which woman will take him back. That decision is theirs. Under any circumstances, he'll be forced to continue to support them both, and he will legalize the status of his son by naming him in his will. These are decent women, Mr. Graham. You're basically a decent man, and that's the whole point. When a man, even with the best intentions, breaks the moral laws we live by, we really don't need man-made laws to punish him. He'll find out that the penalty of the court is always the smallest punishment. Sentence will be passed by this court 1 week from this day at 11 a.m. The court is adjourned.
ending, isn't it? What Lupino just did there was pretty intense. She just pointed out that the practice of bigamy might be illegal, at least in part, because it can empower and legitimize the status of women who give birth to children out of wedlock. Boom! Much like the institution of marriage itself originally is established to express the idea that women were property being given away, but dressed up in the guise of celebrating the bride. It's all about the bride, right? Or women's health magazines giving women body image issues and anxiety under the guise of helping women lose weight and be healthy and beautiful. Similarly, Lupino seems to suggest here that perhaps this law against bigamy is actually, to a degree, designed to be predatory against women, to shame them, but hides behind the guise of protecting and helping women, much like many of our other institutions still do to this day. Fascinating food for thought, brought to you by Ida Lupino. Now, unfortunately, from here on out, the story of female directors in Hollywood runs pretty high and dry until the 1980s. After Dorothy Arzner left Hollywood in 1943 and Ida Lupino had a couple of indie hits in the 50s, as I said, we don't really see anything major directed by women, apart from some fairly obscure independent films, documentaries, and foreign films, until Elaine May directs Ishtar in 1987. That's an enormous gap of nearly 2.5 decades, and though well-known and widely released, even Ishtar wasn't technically produced by a major film studio, though it did have, a reasonably high budget and 2 A-lister stars in it. Let's take a look at the trailer to Ishtar right now.
3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, and...
These men are pawns. I put a price of 20,000 dirham on their heads.
Next, they will be hailed as the 2 messengers of God.
They were just a couple of songwriters who came to Ishtar to break into show business.
Easy boy, easy boy.
What the hell's the matter with him? Is he blind?
Well, yeah, he is, but he's in perfect condition.
So how do they wind up on everyone's hit list?
Your life is in danger.
Behave normally. We have guns pointed at your back. No, don't put your hands up, you idiot.
Oh, little darling. My little darling.
I can't believe these men may control the fate of the Middle East.
Oh, where are you?
Do it.
This is unbelievable.
Knowing well that my lover.
Are the 2 American messengers of God dead yet?
Is this the oasis?
Does this look like an oasis to you?
Yeah, look at the birds. Are those vultures?
Yeah. Just for you.
He's aiming at it.
Will you stop being paranoid?
Run, Smuck! They're trying to kill us.
Warren Beatty, Dustin Hoffman, Isabella Gianni.
Your girl? How did she get to be your girl?
Only you.
I think they're wonderful.
Ishtar, written and directed by Elaine May.
This is some of our best work.
Now, the weird thing about Ishtar is that anyone from the generation currently in their 60s and 70s will tell you it's famous for being the worst movie ever made, and none of them will have seen it themselves. I'm serious, you can test this, and I'll give extra credit, that is, to anyone who actually has a conversation with an older relative and reports back to me about whatever they say. This film was so famously panned by critics before it was, really out, that basically no one went to see it, and as a result it was a tremendous flop, to the point where there are literally Far Side cartoons that depict it as the only movie available to borrow to watch in hell. But here's the thing. I've actually seen the movie Ishtar. For a lark, when I was in high school, my dad and I borrowed the film from the library and watched it so as to laugh at it. And to our surprise, we didn't laugh at it, we laughed with it. Ishtar is really funny. It's actually really good. This was a bizarre discovery. You know, basically, we both really, really liked it. The film was great. It's sharp, witty, very, very funny, brilliantly satirical about the incompetence of the CIA. And my father, who was the original Professor Saporin, he was a film professor before me, and I am following in his footsteps. He actually even wondered aloud whether or not there was some kind of conspiracy going on against the film. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. Certainly nothing to justify it being famous as the worst movie ever made. Leave that designation to Plan 9 from Outer Space or something that really deserves it.
Oh, hi, Mark.
We may never know the answer, but it does strike me as at least extremely odd that this film was simultaneously one of the first big budget pictures directed by a woman in decades, and was also highly critical of the CIA, and was so unfairly maligned by critics that its failure at the box office became the most famous thing about it. I don't mean to be spreading conspiracy theories or anything. I have no empirical evidence whatsoever to back up any of these claims, and it's totally possible that this is all just a weird coincidence. Absolutely. But it is a bizarre circumstance nevertheless, and I would encourage you to watch the film Ishtar for yourself to see whether or not you think it really deserves its bad reputation. The following year, however, Penny Marshall directed Big, a film co-produced by 20th Century Fox, a major Hollywood film studio, and thus making Big perhaps the biggest production directed by a woman since 1943. While it's definitely a weird premise for a movie and maybe a little uncomfortable if you really think about it by today's standards, or for anyone who really thought about it back in, you know, the 1980s, either way, let's take a look at the trailer to the movie Big.
For Josh Baskin, life was a little unfair.
Told you to take out the garbage. Mr. Bus. Can I tell you again, Josh? Joshua Baskin. Josh!
Until he made a little wish.
I wish I were big.
Sweetheart, it's 7:30. Are you up? Josh!
20th Century Fox presents Tom Hanks. Big.
I turned into a grown-up, Mom. I made this wish on a machine, and it turned me into a grown-up.
So now what?
You get a job.
Cannot get a job. I play with all of this stuff, and then I tell them what I think.
And they pay you for that? Suckers!
Vice President, he's only been here a week.
See that girl over there in the red? She'll wrap her legs around you so tight you'll be begging for mercy.
Well, I'll stay away from her then.
I loved your ideas on the squeezy doll line.
Thanks.
What were you like when you were younger?
Oh, well, I wasn't much different.
Ejector seat!
Who are you? I'm his girlfriend. I want to spend the night with you.
Do you mean sleep over?
Yeah.
Okay. But I get to be on top.
What is so special about Baskin?
He's a grown-up.
How do I feel about what?
How do you feel about me?
You're only young once.
This is important!
I'm your best friend. What's more important than that, huh?
But for Josh...
I miss my family, Susan, and I want to go home.
Oh, my God, you're married.
It just might last a lifetime. You'll never forget Tom Hanks.
Beluga.
In Big.
Now, obviously, Big was a big success, and the first really major directorial work of Penny Marshall, leading to more opportunities for her later on, perhaps most notably A League of Their Own in 1992. A League of Their Own is a film based on the then largely forgotten history of female Major League Baseball players who took up the game in the absence of men fighting World War II. Let's take a look at some clips from A League of Their Own right now.
On the home front, they find them everywhere. North, east, south, and west, and even Canada. Players for the new All-American Girls Baseball League. After the first month of league play, the shine still isn't off these diamond gals. Alice Skeeter Gasper says legging out a triple is no reason to let your nose get shiny. Betty Grable has nothing on these gals. Helen Haley has not only been a member of several championship amateur teams, she's also an accomplished coffee maker. With her husband in the Pacific, Betty Horn enjoys cooking spaghetti and knitting. Her teammates call her Betty Spaghetti. Ellen Sue Gotlander is a former Miss Georgia. Yow. Then there's Pretty Dottie Hinson, who plays like Gehrig and looks like Garbo. Fellas, keep your mitts to yourself. She's married. And there's her kid sister, Kit, who's as single as they come. Enough concentrated oomph for a whole carload of Hollywood starlets. And how about Marla Hooch? What a hitter. What a league. But girls playing baseball?
That sounded good.
Kate, you haven't got a curveball left, okay?
I don't have a curveball left?
Have
you been watching
the
during
third
this
inning?
game?
This is great. They're jumping, they're hopping, they're cheering, and they paid to get in here. You did a fabulous job, Ira. I won't forget this.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Harvey. Thank you very much. I appreciate it coming from you. But to be perfectly honest, I think the girls deserve most of the credit.
Oh, they're great. Fortunately, we won't need them anymore. Do you want a peanut?
No. What do you mean?
What do you mean, what do I mean? We're winning the war. Our situation changed. I mean, Roosevelt himself said men's baseball won't be shut down. So we won't need the girls next year.
Bases loaded, the bottom of the ninth. Rockford up 6-2, 2 men out. No balls, 2 strikes. And that is the ball game. Rockford is in the playoffs.
I love these girls. I don't need them, but I love them. Look at them. Come on, let's go. Look at me, full of peanuts. Peanuts all over my shirt.
This is what it's going to be like in the factories, too, I suppose, isn't it? Men are back, Rosie. Turn in your rivets. We told them it was their patriotic duty to get out of the kitchen and go to work. And now when the men come back, we'll send them back to the kitchen.
What should we do? Send the boys returning from war back to the kitchen? Come on.
Excuse me. Do you know how dedicated these girls are? What they go through? They play with sprained ankles, broken fingers. They ride a bus sometimes all night to play a doubleheader the next morning.
I'll make it up to them.
What, with Harvey bars?
Getting tired of listening to you, Ira.
Mr. Harvey, I'd like your permission to take over the league.
Ira, do you understand? All of the owners are getting out. There's no point to it anymore. Just let them finish the season and that's it.
I sold your product when there was no product. This is a product.
There is no room for girls' baseball in this country once the war is over. They're through.
I think you're wrong. And I'm going to prove it to you, Mr. Harvey.
High fastballs. Just can't hit him, can't lay off.
All right. All right, we just hold him now. We got it. Come on. Come on, Ellen-Sue. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Walter, what do you say?
All right, Ira. We'll stick with it.
My mother always used to say,
Shut up,
if
Helen.
at first you don't succeed.
Yeah, that's easy for you to say. You don't have to spend the next 6 months in Saskatchewan.
Alice, you told me it's lovely.
Yeah, I feel like ice fish.
What's your name? Mary. Mary? Who are you rooting for? Racing! That's what I thought you said. Yeah. Okay, you guys be good. Get dirty.
Now remember those other two things that I brought up before, right? The two hidden assignment things? The things I asked you to bookmark in your brain? Well, bookmark this one too, because A League of Their Own is the third part of this week's hidden assignment question, which is, What parallels do you see between these stories, and what do you think it might imply about A, the question of what happened to women in the silent film industries, and B, the question of women's history in literally any and every other existing professional field? More information on how to submit it and when it will be due coming later on, so stay tuned. Now, in the clip that we just watched where the league manager tries to convince the owner not to shut down the women's baseball league, we hear him make a reference to the mass exodus of women from the workforce following World War II. During the war years, women were called upon to fill literally every existing job, from heavy lifting factory work to corporate business executives to Major League Baseball players, while men went off to fight the war. It was during this time that a generation of women learned firsthand that there was literally no job in America that they couldn't do as well as men. A knowledge which the government tried very, very hard to, and was ultimately, unfortunately, successful in suppressing throughout the regressive post-war era, mostly through 1950s media and, sort of PR campaigns bombarding women with the idea that a woman's place is in the home. And that's true. The government really did this. I'm not conspiracy theorizing at all here. There's a lot of, if you want the links, just email me. I'd happily introduce you to this unfortunate reality. So, to the point where, prior to the release of A League of Their Own, women's contributions to Major League Baseball, much like their contributions to the Wasps and their contributions to the early film industry, had been practically erased from history. Interesting piece of historiography there, isn't it? Interesting to see what gets preserved and recorded and what doesn't. What, must be dug up by later scholars, basically excavated and revealed later on in forums like this class, so that it'll hopefully someday become common knowledge, like, the achievements and accomplishments of men already are. But the thing about the film that I still keep coming back to, that I find most striking personally, is that moment where the three little girls run up to Kit, the female baseball player who literally just won the World Series, and ask for her autograph. Because it was at that moment, when I was watching this film in preparation for this class, that I realized that by and large, girls in this country grow up with a real deprivation of the kinds of sports heroes that boys get to have in droves. Even outside of sports, girls are given very few real-life role models outside of fictional characters, and those that they do have, like I imagine maybe actresses and female politicians, are much less accessible than a sports star whose fly ball you might catch or whose jersey you might wear. It's really an entirely different category. Outside of specific niche interests and subcultural minor celebrities, I struggle to think of a single real-life female role model who compares to the countless droves of male sports idols available for boys to choose from within every conceivable sport. Watching the film invites the question of why female major league sports were ever allowed to end, or rather, why their media publicity was ever allowed to end, of how much we allow female children to be deprived of in this nation without highly celebrated female sports heroes on par with their male counterparts, and why we continue to live in a world where sports are gender segregated with only the male sports teams given any significant media attention, even in cases where their female counterparts are far more successful, skilled, and accomplished athletes. If John Oliver can prove to us that even marbles can serve as inspiring sports idols during a pandemic when major league sports are indefinitely suspended, then what the heck are we doing with a mass media culture that won't accept women as legitimate world-class sports idols, especially if, in the supposedly regressive past, we already had female Major League Baseball teams that were successfully promoted and supported by the contemporary media, got the crowds as excited and invested as they were in their male counterparts, and were heroes to a good 51% of the population population, especially the child population, which, you know, obviously currently goes on, underserved and ignored by a cultural media that privileges male sports idols literally at the expense of the hopes and dreams of the children of the future. Now, moving on, apart from these brief examples in the late 1980s and 1990s, we don't really see another major Hollywood studio film directed by a woman again until The Hurt Locker in 2008, a film for which Kathryn Bigelow won the Academy Award for Best Directing, making her the first and so far the only woman ever to receive this award. Again, this brings up an interesting question of historiography, the question of not only who is recorded, but of who is celebrated for what they do. To give you an understanding of what I mean, let's take a look at the trailer to The Hurt Locker right now.
Welcome to Camp Victory. Oh, Camp Victory? I thought this was Camp Liberty. Oh, no, they changed that about a week ago. Victory sound better. All right.
So what do you got? The car has been parked illegally. The suspension is sagging. There's definitely something heavy in the trunk.
Interesting. What's he doing? I'm gonna die. I wanna die comfortable.
How many bombs have you disarmed?
873.
873? You're a wild man, you know that?
That was too bad. Our first time working together. What do you think? I think us working together means I talk to you and you talk to me.
You going on a date, Sanborn?
My team leader is inspiring. He's gonna get me killed.
What's the best way to go about disarming one of these things?
The way you don't die, sir.
That was good. What do we have here?
This box is full of stuff that almost killed me.
What about this one? Where's this one from, Will?
It's my wedding ring. Like I said, stuff that almost killed me.
Put down the phone! Burn him, Aldrin! I can't get a shot!
I was scared.
Yeah?
Well, everyone's a coward about something.
We're going on a mission. And my job is to keep you safe so we can keep going on missions.
It's combat, buddy.
Go! Everybody get back! Go, go, go!
You realize every time you suit up, it's life or death.
Found something.
You roll the dice. And you deal with it.
Oh, boy.
So did you notice anything in particular about that movie? Did anything stand out to you? Like, for example, that it was the most testosterone-drenched film that we've screened so far in this class, all about male soldiers and explosions, with no main female characters, set in a war zone, and possibly one of the manliest movies that's ever been made. I personally think it's kind of funny that the trailer contains that slate that quotes Richard Corliss of Time magazine, calling the film a near-perfect movie. Richard Corliss being, of course, an older white man whose opinion, I would argue, is therefore kind of biased towards this kind of a movie in a way that I don't think that the average female critic's opinion would be. It's interesting to me that this is the film that got the first female director the only Academy Award that has ever been given to a woman for directing. It seems to suggest a narrative in which women's works and achievements are only valued by the industry in terms of how much they resemble the works and achievements of men. In a way, this is sort of similar to how Dorothy Arzner appears to have been accepted as the studio system's sole female director, at least in part for presenting herself like one of the guys, and thus not challenging the patriarchal assumption that manly works that resemble those of men and or the works of people who behave and present themselves like men are inherently of higher value and considered preferable to the non-masculine works of non-masculine people. Again, this is about the question of who holds power in a society. I find it very interesting that the further in time you go, the more the works of the few female directors that we have seem to resemble the works of male directors. It's really interesting to me how, perhaps aside from A League of Their Own, most of the films directed by women in the modern era seem to be very much at odds with the content of the films that came before, made by female directors in, the silent era, even up to, the 1950s. Basically, we see much less filmic discourse of progressive issues, social problems, or women's concerns, and much more standard entertainment fare, of the type that a male director might be assigned to handle, suggesting a certain pressure on women to conform to male standards rather than tell their own stories, with by far the manliest film of the lot being the sole Academy Award winner for a woman director in all of film history. For the final part of your hidden assignment, aha, have I got you? I want you to comment on this. What does it make you think and feel? Tell me your thoughts in a way that will be revealed shortly. I'll let you know on what platform to submit it, so stay tuned. I'll also let you know when it's due, so keep watching. Now, in recent years, there has been an increase in major Hollywood studio films directed by women, though still only a very slight increase and still pathetic and small considering women's original directorial numbers in the silent film industries. Let's take a look now at perhaps my favorite of the recent films directed by women, 2017's Wonder Woman.
Heute ist aber alles abgefallen. Heute moet ze diegene die niet konden en snappen, die worden uitslaven meegenomen.
Wat is het gebeurd?
Bert, aan die andere kant van die loeg af.
Dinah, we have to go.
We need to help these people.
We have to stay on mission.
The next safe crossing is at least a day away. What are we waiting
We
for?
cannot leave without helping them. These people are dying. Nothing to eat, and in the village enslaved, she said.
I understand that.
Women,
we need
children.
to make our next position by
How
sunlight.
can you say that? What is the matter with you?
This is no man's land, Diana. It means no man can cross it, all right? This battalion has been here for nearly a year, and they barely gained an inch. All right, because on the other side, there are a bunch of Germans pointing machine guns at every square inch of this place. This is not something you can cross. It's not possible.
So what? So we do nothing?
No, we are doing something. We are. We can't save everyone in this war. This is not what we came here to do.
No, but it's what I'm going to do.
Diana!
What the bloody hell is she playing at? Engage! Fire!
She's taking all the fire. Let's go! 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 Down! Strike them! Strike them!
perhaps the most famous directorial work of Patty Jenkins, who, like other female directors, made her way to the world of film through directing for television. I want to pause here for a moment and address an interesting issue. There are actually a great number of female television directors, far more than film directors, and far too many to list here by name. But you can see it for yourself. Watch any TV show that you like and pay attention to who gets listed as the director of any given episode. If it's a recent TV show, you'll see a lot of female names. Perhaps this suggests, again, that directing is indeed, like we all knew, a gender-neutral job, and illustrates again the gender divide's relationship with status, money, and power in a patriarchal culture. It's not so much that men in charge think that women are incapable of directing. Obviously, the great number of female television directors, as well as made-for-TV movies, belies this idea. Rather, it is the idea that film directors, unlike television directors, command a large amount of respect, power, and of course money, all of which seem to be coded male in the minds of studio executives and other administrators in charge of hiring directors for major theatrically released motion pictures. It seems to be a question of power and status, just like it was in the silent era, to my reading. Why did women get kicked out? Well, because they figured out that film directing came with power, and in a society that codes the very idea of what a man is as superior to a woman, giving women power was threatening, yada yada. Similarly, in television, we have all of these female directors directing television, and no one has a problem with it because television directors don't make as much money or command as much respect, power, or fame as television directors do in the industry. That really does seem to be the divide. But the statistics are very telling. Let's use some empiricism now. According to the Directors Guild of America, half the episodes of television made in the season of 2018 to 2019 were directed by women or by people of color. Compare that to the fact that just barely 18% of the films of 2019 were directed by people of color and only 12% by women, meaning collectively the film industry lags at least 30 percentage points lower than the television industry in terms of the diversity of its directors. Considering that with the advent of streaming services, the job of directing for television has become pretty much identical with the job of directing for film, it should be plain to any casual observer that the film industry's failure to hire women and people of color as directors has to do with deep-seated historical biases, sexism, and racism, and not at all with any lack of available talent or diverse directors who already exist doing their jobs to draw from. Patty Jenkins is, of course, worthy of celebration, don't get me wrong, but understand her as a rare exception to the rule, a female television director who broke into a deeply gender-segregated film directing platform when there are untold numbers of equally qualified female directors whom Hollywood ignores en masse from the world of television. Even Wonder Woman, with all of its powerful feminism, is still a Marvel movie and hence intended to appeal primarily to teenage boys. It's a film, full of action and explosions and combat. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with those things. I enjoy them myself. I agree. But it still places the film in a context of an industry that, ever since Jaws came out in 1975, believes its primary audience to be male and adolescent. Whether or not this is true, it's totally what the Hollywood business moguls think, and hence puts pressure on all of its directors, both male and female, to present their work in a way that prioritizes the teenage male demographic, thus inherently perpetuating an ongoing gender bias in the industry, even within films directed by women. That said, I still really like Wonder Woman. Now, to return to the world of independent film, let's screen a clip from another film from the same year, 2017, Lady Bird, directed by Greta Gerwig. Let's watch.
I hate California. I want to go to the East Coast.
I want to go where culture is, like
How
New
in the
York.
world did I raise such a
or at least
snob?
Connecticut or New Hampshire, where writers live in the
Get
woods.
into those schools anyway.
Mom!
You should just go to City College. You know, with your work ethic, just go to City College and then to jail, and then back to City College, and then maybe you'd learn to pull yourself up and not expect everybody to do everything.
Lady Bird, is that your given name?
Yeah.
Why is it in quotes?
I gave it to myself. It's given to me by me.
Lady Bird always says that she lives on the wrong side of the tracks, but I always thought that was like a metaphor. But there are actual train tracks.
What she did was very baller. It was very anarchist.
Put the magazine back!
She has a big heart, your mom.
She's warm, but she's also kind of scary.
You can't be scary and warm.
I think you can. Your mom is.
So, you're not interested in any Catholic colleges?
No way. I want schools like Yale, but not Yale because I probably couldn't get in.
You definitely couldn't get in.
Does Mom hate me?
If you're tired, we can sit down.
I'm not tired.
You were dragging your feet.
You are so infuriating.
Please stop yelling.
I'm not yelling. Oh, it's perfect.
Do you love it?
You both have such strong personalities.
When is a normal time to have sex?
You're having sex?
I'm ready. Just wanted it to be special.
Why? You're gonna have so much unspecial sex in your life.
We're afraid that we will never escape our past.
Whatever we give you, it's never enough. It's never enough.
It is enough.
We're afraid of what the future will bring. We're afraid we won't be loved.
You can't do anything unless you're the center of attention.
We won't be liked.
Yeah, well, you know your mom's tits, they're totally fake. She made one bad decision at 19. 2 bad decisions.
And we won't succeed.
I want you to be the very best version of yourself that you can be.
What if this is the best version? What I'd really like is to be on Math Olympiad.
But math isn't something you're terribly strong in.
That we know of yet.
Now, interestingly, this little slice of life coming of age film feels a little more in line with the kind of work we might expect from a female director unburdened by the demands of a major Hollywood studio, which is exactly what it is, and hence it has what some film scholars refer to as that independent film feel. You know, a quirky, non-blockbuster quality that makes a film stand out against the standard major studio fare as being somehow different or other. It's interesting to me because that's very much how female directors are treated in Hollywood, as being somehow different or other when they, you know, were once seen as quite normal. And it's further interesting to me that the majority of female directors who work in the feature film industry do so independently from the major film studios, even today. The big studios are so unlikely to hire women that female directors disproportionately work in independent film, just because it's possible for them to break into independent film, perhaps using the perception of their difference to their advantage because independent film sells itself on its difference. Now, the final film clip that I want to screen for you tonight is the recent film Emma from this year, directed by Autumn de Wilde. Let's take a look at Emma right now.
Dearly beloved friends, we gather here in this time of man's great innocence.
Innocence? Innocence? No?
Mr. Elton!
Emma.
Probably no father's gentleman and a gentleman of fortune.
Miss Woodhouse! Miss Woodhouse! Such news!
Now, obviously, Emma being adapted from a Jane Austen novel, the film is more in line with a traditionalist idea of a woman's picture, and hence does admittedly seem inherently logical as a project to be directed by a woman. Like some of the other films that we've talked about today, Emma is a film with a lot of women in the crew. It seems as though having a female director on any given project tends to result in far more women being hired to fill the other necessary roles behind the camera, which, makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because women are obviously more likely than men to know and have worked with other women, made bonds, friendships, connections, and consider them as equals and primary candidates for job opportunities. I think in a very real way, both men and women sort of typecast themselves as like, oh, it's like, like this is a person like me, they'll be likely to do a good job. And, in a male-dominated industry, that's part of how, the fact that all the jobs are male get perpetuated. Let's see. All the jobs are cast male, I should say. Just scrolling through the IMDb page for the film reveals tremendously long lists of female names, far more than you usually see from Hollywood. And again, Emma, though a fairly expensive-looking picture, is in fact yet another independent film. So where does that leave us? Well, hopefully with a knowledge of a more expansive perspective on the history of female film directors in American cinema, a story echoed to varying degrees in the world cinemas of other countries around the globe. The strange trajectory of women dominating the silent film industries from the dawn of cinema until the soft purge of 1920, Lois Weber and Dorothy Arzner making it past that point in the studio system alone as Hollywood's only two female film directors, seemingly because of box office success on the one hand and perceived masculinity on the other. We then see a drought of over 40 years in which the only films made by women are independent productions like those of Ida Lupino until the late 1980s, when Hollywood gives Penny Marshall a chance at Big, with only a few more major releases directed by women from then until fairly recently. It continues to be the case that women direct independent film and television episodes in larger numbers, proving the obvious that there is no dearth of female talent in the world of film directing. It's just that they don't draw from the appropriate pools. They prefer to rehire the same men again and again. And everybody in the Hollywood industry knows this. This is not a secret. And yet, Hollywood continues to employ a workforce where roughly 88% of its top films are given to men to direct, in spite of the widely held knowledge that there are huge numbers of blockbuster-grade female directors out there being totally ignored. We also see the ways in which perceived masculinity is rewarded in the film industry, and perceived femininity, along with its progressive inclinations, are systematically silenced, beginning with the Hays Code and going on to the present day with the continued perception on the part of the major studios that entertainment fare targeted at teenage boys should be the real priority of Hollywood, and of course the idea that the manlier, movies made by women are the near-perfect films worthy of Academy Awards. For your hidden assignment, please answer the 3 questions stated earlier in this video on tonight's discussion board, found under the Discussions tab of Web Campus. This will be due this time at 11:30 p.m. tonight. Oh, keeping you on your toes. It's not the same time as before. What? And again, I'll give extra credit to anyone who replies intelligently to anyone else's comment. That's all for tonight. Good night, good luck, and thank you for joining me on this delightful weekly explosion of the Hollywood patriarchy. I'll see you soon.
We found sanctuary in the hurt locker, a spot of safety on the roads. Love can be scary in the hurt locker. It's tender and it's raw. We're filled with shock and awe, and we will be consumed when love